Hi, this is Cheryl Gallant, your Conservative Member of Parliament for the proud of property ownership riding of Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke. Canada's Minister of Justice should go back to school. He is not just the Minister of Justice, but he's also the Attorney General of Canada. This minister got the job when Trudeau shoved Jody Wilson-Raybould aside after she refused to cave into Trudeau's pressure over the SNC-Lavalin corruption case. Not an honorable start. Now, this Attorney General / Justice Minister has proven himself to be deplorably unqualified for the position. The minister recently proclaimed Canadians do not have an absolute right to private property, end quote. He then cited the Expropriation Act as evidence that Canadians do not have an absolute right to private property. Take a look.
Well, look, we'll obviously tailor the provisions so that it can withstand a court challenge. You don't have an absolute right to own private property in Canada. There are steps that are taken when expropriations happen at whatever level of government, and we'll be sure to stay within those boundaries.
It's clear from his statement this individual has no business being the Justice Minister. Allow me to expand on this. The Expropriation Act is actually proof that Canadians absolutely do have a right to private property. The entire point of the Expropriation Act is to place limits on the government. The entire point of the Expropriation Act is to recognize and protect private property rights. The law sets out the conditions under which the government can force you to exchange a specific piece of property for an equivalent value of property. If the government comes along and says it needs your land to build a highway, the government cannot just seize your land. The government must follow each step in the act, including public notice, a hearing, and a settlement. And all of this is reviewable by the courts. Now, the Expropriation Act is not perfect, and that's precisely why I tried to amend it during the last Parliament with Bill C-222. Of course, the Socialists voted against it. You see, Socialists do not believe you have a right to private property. Socialists believe they have a right to your property. Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin were tax and spend liberals, but they were not socialists. These socialist Trudeau liberals have formed an alliance with the socialist NDP. It's only been a few months, and already this socialist coalition has launched a number of attacks on property rights. And it's not just the minister saying it. Bill C-21 is actually a form of de facto expropriation. This is when the government renders your property worthless and does not compensate you with property equal to the original value. Bill C-21 is marketed as a handgun freeze. The truth is, it's just a delayed confiscation. The government will simply wait till you die, then take your property. In the past, the Supreme Court actually allowed de facto expropriations as long as the government did not actually come to possess the property. While the handgun freeze has effectively destroyed the market value of the property, until the government actually comes into possession of the handgun, the courts will likely uphold the freeze. every Canadian should be deeply troubled by this assault on property rights. Property comes in many forms, but ultimately it's the fruit of your labor. If we allow the government to destroy the value of unpopular property today, like they're doing with handguns, what is to stop the socialists from destroying your property tomorrow? Your property. Help me defend property rights in Canada. The Liberals, NDP, and the Bloc have teamed up to cut off debate on the Online Tax and Censor Streaming Act. I had hoped to have one more chance to speak on this proposed law. I know many Canadians are deeply worried about this bill and hope the Senate will somehow stop it. They won't. At most, they could amend the bill and send it back to the House of Commons. Then the Liberals and Bloc and NDP will just as fast track it back to the Senate. At that point, the Senate has no real option but to rubber stamp it. Then it'll head to the courts, which is why the Liberals are afraid of debate in the House of Commons. When courts have to pass judgment on whether a law is constitutional, they will often look at the speeches given by members of Parliament. So, every time I've spoken on this bill, including the last Parliament, I've set out why this bill is unconstitutional. Now, I can tell you that the Liberals, the NDP, and Bloc were so full of themselves, they never noticed. They never once tried to respond to the points I made in my speeches. They never actually tried to argue that this bill actually was constitutional. I'm not just talking about the serious threat it poses to freedom of expression. I'm talking about the threat this poses to the provinces. If this law passes, if it's not challenged, then the federal government will have claimed that it actually has authority over any business that's online. Most industries are provincially regulated. Between C11, the Online Tax and Censor Streaming Act, and Bill C18, the Legacy Media Welfare Act, the federal government is claiming if the business happens on the internet, it's federal jurisdiction. This is unconstitutional, plain and simple. Today and tomorrow we'll be voting on this very dangerous legislation. The Senate may delay final passage, but it's on track to become law. Make no mistake, Conservatives will repeal this law the first chance we get. The fight for freedom is never over. Live from Ottawa, this is Cheryl Gallant.